Well, we'll kick off the meeting then. So thank you all for joining us bright and early on this Friday morning for a special meeting of the Governor's Workforce Council. This meeting is designed to inform you all more about Workforce Pell and the roles and responsibilities of the Governor's Workforce Council and the opportunities that all of you have to participate in this really important national opportunity for our state to expand Workforce Pell eligibility to non-credit training programs. And if you want to turn the slide, a quick agenda for today. We're going to go through what all of those eligibilities are and then the opportunities for your participation at varying levels of whatever you're interested in participating in. And as we move through this, I do want to make introductions to two team members that are really focusing on this work on behalf of OWS. And the first is Ben Hensley. Ben is a governor's fellow with us and has really been taking the charge on pulling all of this really complicated information together and putting it into a format that we can all easily understand and work through. So, Ben, if you want to just say a quick hello.
Good morning, everyone.
And you'll hear a little bit more from Ben in a little bit. And then also, I'd like to introduce Mayor Kirhan. She's a retired professor from UConn. Also was my advisor on my doctorate program, and we're really happy to have her support facilitating the work from our end. Mariki, you want to say a quick hello?
Good morning, everyone. I'm really looking forward to working with the many teams that will be involved in this project.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's just jump right in then. We can skip down, I think, to slide 6 and get through the roll call stuff that we don't need to do. Okay, slide 6. Okay. So, the background around Workforce Pell. This has been an initiative that I think the feds have been looking at for a long time, and it was included in HR1 that was passed last year. And the Workforce Pell has three separate components to it. First, it expands Pell grants. Now, if you're familiar, I believe you're all familiar with Pell grants. It's the federal scholarship funding for college for those who meet low income requirements. And if you've heard of the FAFSA, that's what you fill out in order to determine your eligibility for Pell. This component expands the usage of Pell to short-term career-focused post-secondary programs. And there's a lot of eligibility rules around that, and we'll share that in more detail. Another important aspect to remember is it's not expanding the amount of Pell dollars that an individual is eligible for. It's allowing them to use their existing Pell dollars, a portion of that, for these short-term credentials. So it's really important that the programming that we provide as eligible is of high quality. And then it expands the student's lifetime funding to a full 12 full-time semester maximum. So that gives people a little bit more time to use the Pell as well. I'm going to go through all of this. There's a lot of information I'm going to give you. If you want to put questions in the chat, the team will go over and answer them as they pop up if appropriate. And we'll also have a time for questions and answers at the end as well of the presentation. Okay, next slide. Okay. Um, there's new eligibility and accountability standards for Workforce Pell. And what this working group is going to be focused on is the policies and processes for the implementation of Pell programming. And that's where this group's responsibilities start to lie. I'm going to give you like a little bit of framework as we think through these. So the things that we need to pay attention to is a definition and alignment with what would be considered a high wage or high skill or in-demand occupations. And that sets the level one portion of the criteria that the Governor's Workforce Council is required to make recommendations to the Governor's office on. Additionally, the programs that are meet those standards also have to be stackable, which means they have to be stackable to a credit-bearing program. Portable, which means they can be seen and recognized by different entities. And a recognized credentialing and recognized credentialing and credit outcomes for students. So we're not going to put dog washing as part of a Workforce Pell eligible program. It has to meet a minimum completion ratio of 70% and employment outcomes of 70%. And so the data that we're going to need to collect here is at a higher level, and employment outcomes are going to be required. There's a 3-year gap where we can state employment in any occupation, but in 3 years, the requirement is employment in the occupation for which your certification was earned. So there's a whole bunch of work that's going to need to be done in order to be able to track that. There's also a requirement that there's value added earning gains for the participant relative to the program cost. So if the program costs $5,000 and the student is only getting a value added gain of, say, $1,000 a year, that might not meet the standard. If they're getting, it costs 5,000 and they're getting a gain of 5,000 or more, that may meet the standard. And then for all of the programs that become eligible, there has to be at least 1 year of history that proves that there's a completion ratio of 70% and an outcome employment ratio of 70%. Okay, next slide. Okay. The governor is responsible for making the policies and determining the decisions in consultation with the state workforce board. So that's why you're all here today, because our agency is leading this work with all of our partners across our higher ed institutions, our government agencies, and others that are part of this decision-making process and building out the framework. But all of you will have a responsibility to understand these policies and approve the recommendations that are going to go to the governor's office. And in his agency will have final say. But I am fairly confident that given all of the deep work that's going to be happening across our state agencies in coordination with our higher ed institutions and all of your input, I don't foresee many changes that will come out of those recommendations. The state staff will implement the policies and processes that form the basis of all of your input. So we'll be creating and informing policy, and the state staff will be doing the implementation. All of you bring really valuable perspectives of this work, whether you are employers or you're involved in higher ed or community-based organizations. This is really a fundamental shift that will allow people from low incomes to be able to earn credentials that are meaningful and lead to an on-ramp to a family sustaining wage. And in some cases, depending upon the certification, may get them to that family sustaining wage sooner than later. So we really do value all that you will be bringing to these discussions and conversations. Okay, next slide. Um, so again, before students can start to receive Workforce Pell, which the feds established July 1 of this year as the beginning of eligibility to pay for Workforce Pell. Now, the majority of states are not going to meet that July 1 for implementation. The rulemaking for this has taken a very long time, and there are still some finalizations of rules that are happening. We do not foresee that any of those will have a major impact here. But for example, and I see several of our union partners on the call, there's a consideration and a strong consideration that related instruction for apprenticeship could be eligible for Workforce Pell. And for all of you, that implication would really open up the ability for people to um, be part of Workforce Pell, whether you're in a union or in a trade. So that's something that is an example of something that will come down later. Now, once all of this happens and all of our policies are done, institutions of higher education then have to submit applications based on what we put together for each Workforce Pell short-term training program, and that application will go to the feds. The state must review and improve programs before they go. So the GWC providing recommendations to the governor. So if there is an application for jewelry making, we might say that does not meet those standards and requirements and criteria that we put in place, and thus would not be eligible to move forward in the application process. And then that goes currently to the Department of Ed to review and approve programs. Um, we may not have a Department of Education in the future, and that might end up at the Department of Labor, or wherever else they end up putting it, should that move happen. So next slide. Our responsibilities, I've kind of been trickling them through, but it is to develop the application criteria, the processes and policies for higher ed to submit their Workforce Pell applications for the state review. And then, really importantly, to establish the back end data sharing infrastructure to support compliance and evaluation. And then also to support and create the public facing information and resources that our public will need to understand the Workforce Pell opportunities that are available to them. So, three things: approval of the process, back end data collection, and front facing information and resources. Okay, next slide. Um, Ben, is this where we switch it over to you?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Happy to jump in, and good morning, everyone, again. So as Kelly's mentioned, there's a lot of work that we have to do in developing definitions, criteria for when institutions of higher ed submit applications around the Workforce Pell programs that they want to have become eligible. And so there's five main deliverables that we're looking at for, again, kind of policies that the state needs to put into place. The first is around how we're going to identify priority sectors and occupations. And so there's three definitions that we need to establish for whether a job is in demand, whether it's high wage, and then whether it's high skill. And so every 2 years, the state will use these definitions to publish a list of priority occupations that meet these criteria. And then institutions will need to align their programs to those priority occupations. Next, we're going to need to develop a policy for determining whether those programs actually meet the hiring requirements of employers. So a program might say they're aligned, but how do we kind of verify whether or not they're actually preparing their learners for employment? And so this is an area where the feds are requiring employer input to be a part of the process. And so we need to determine how we can kind of garner that employer input without making it burdensome on companies. So establishing that standard for validation. Next, we need to create a policy around evaluating the stackability and portability of credentials. So how many employers recognize a certain credential? What are the wage gains associated with one credential? And then what are the opportunities that that credential sets the learner up for, whether it's additional credentials, additional degrees, additional kind of career advancement opportunities, but we'll need to define what that looks like and the data that we need to measure that stackability. We're also going to need a policy around determining whether programs are credit bearing. So again, one of the nuances of Workforce Pell is that we're taking a lot of programs that maybe haven't had degrees associated with them, haven't been credit bearing, and making sure that they articulate into credit bearing pathways. So learners are gaining a credential and they're also gaining credit toward an associate or a bachelor's degree. And then kind of encompassing all of this, we need a program application process that allows us to collect all of the data elements necessary to calculate things like the job placement rate, to calculate things like the completion rate, whether programs align, how we're kind of securely receiving that data from institutions of higher ed, and then how we are able to measure it against things like wage records that the state has and make those calculations so we can validate all of the outcomes. So these are, I think, the main responsibilities ahead of us. And so we're organizing this work into 4 work groups. As Kelly mentioned, the state agencies are doing a lot around kind of formulating the policies based on input from the Governor's Workforce Council. And so each work group is responsible for some of the key deliverables that we've talked about. There's 4 groups, and the first one looks at that priority occupations list, as well as the hiring requirement policy and the stackability and portability policy. These all, again, require employer input. They're very related in terms of the information that we're going to need to collect from institutions that are applying. So this work group's covering these 3 policies. And for each work group, we've identified 2 state agencies that are kind of co-leading the process. There's a number of other state agencies that are involved in these work groups that have assigned kind of technical staff pertinent to each work group, but these will be meeting. We plan kind of bi-weekly over the next few months to develop these policies. And then at the Q2 GWC meeting, we'll be providing an update. And at the Q3 GWC meeting, we will be finalizing these policies so that we can send them to the governor's office for further review and approval. But the second work group is focused on the credit articulation policy. So again, this has CSU and the Office of Higher Ed as those co-leading agencies, given their expertise, really focused on how we're ensuring that Workforce Pell programs articulate to credit and that credit's recognized by multiple institutions. The third work group is focused on that application and appeals process, so co-led by the Office of Higher Ed and OWS, focused again on how we're collecting data from institutions as they apply, how we are conducting the review process, who's involved in the review process, and then also what do appeals look like, how are we renewing applications when institutions have been in the program for more than a year and they need to renew the process, how do we do that as well? The fourth group is focused on data and evaluation. So as Kelly mentioned earlier, we're building an application, but we're also building kind of the back-end infrastructure and the public-facing resources. So really looking at how are we presenting this to learners, and also how is this aligned to the broader workforce system. So whether that's American Job Center resources, whether that's students coming out of CTEX or SDE, kind of how are we making sure that the journey and the utilization of Workforce Pell is as efficient as possible. So I'm going to walk through each of these groups and the deliverables in a little bit more detail. And again, I think what we're really looking for is to see how can GWC members participate in these work groups as your interest and expertise allows. Kind of what are the areas that are most interesting to you? Where do you think you can weigh in and participate in this process? Again, recognizing that we'll also be presenting these at the Q2 and Q3 GWC meetings. So again, looking at the priority sectors and occupations list, the main deliverable is that list of occupations that the state will publish as part of the WIOA plan every 2 years going forward. So we're creating definitions around things like in demand, high wage, high skill. We're looking at the data collection process of where we're going to source that data, how we're going to analyze it, and then also how we're going to publish that information to the public and to the institutions of higher ed. So this is a little more technical, but really focused on the criteria that we're using to determine priority jobs. The next policy, again, is around the hiring requirements. And so determining whether a program is actually meeting the hiring requirements of employers. So taking that list of priority occupations and then establishing some methods to help institutions demonstrate that they are aligned to the skill needs and the hiring requirements of those jobs. So this might be things like employer letters. This could look like a crosswalk of program learning outcomes to occupational competencies as found in job postings. There's a number of ways that we can get at this, but we need to determine what those criteria are and how we'll be evaluating them. Another consideration here, as Kelly mentioned, is that the related technical instruction component of registered apprenticeship programs kind of auto qualifies under this standard. So if you are providing related technical instruction, the feds have said, you meet this standard kind of by default because you're working with an employer. And so part of our process will be, how do we validate the presence of RTI? And given that Workforce Pell is limited to institutions of higher education, how are we validating when those institutions have made partnerships with entities providing related technical instruction? So there's a bit of work to do there around how we kind of recognize those partnerships for registered apprenticeship providers. The next policy, and again, this is the last one that the employment and credentialing work group will be focused on, is really looking at stackability and portability of credentials. So this is really considering how a credential prepares learners for multiple employment opportunities and then further career advancement. So we will need to define kind of what portability looks like, how many employers recognize a certain credential, how many institutions recognize a credential, is it a prerequisite for further training? And kind of similar in the theme of stackability, what does this credential prepare you for in terms of immediate career opportunities? And then what are the future roles with hopefully, again, associated wage gains that the credential will prepare you for? And so kind of at the basic level, we need to establish definitions, but the feds are also pushing us to identify a data collection process to actually measure how many learners go on to get these additional credentials and additional kind of career advancement opportunities. And finally, with this one as well, we do need to determine a process for employer validation. And so I think especially from this group, thinking about how we are streamlining the ask to companies so that it's very clear what businesses need to do to weigh in on these programs. We're not making the ask onerous to companies, but we are establishing, some genuine validation, meaningful engagement with the program. And so I think especially for this work group, we're going to be bringing in, especially, the GWC, but also other employer representatives to kind of validate these policies, again, thinking about the ask to companies. And thinking about that next work group focused on the credit articulation policy. This one, again, is very focused on, how the institutions of higher ed are evaluating the Workforce Pell programs, aligning them to credit, and then also making sure that multiple eligible institutions are recognizing the credential. So our learners finishing the program with a portable, set of credit that will allow them to advance toward a degree after the program. So again, I think this one will be much more technical, much more focused on the kind of higher ed landscape, but they're really, again, trying to develop a policy that the state will use to evaluate whether or not institutions have this in place for all of their Workforce Pell programs. The next work group, again, is focused on the application itself that institutions of higher education will use as they're trying to have Workforce Pell programs become eligible. And then we'll also be looking at the appeal process and the renewal process for programs. So this will, I think, largely be a technical work group focused on the data elements that are required for us to calculate things like the job placement rate and the completion rate. This might end up requiring participant level data so that we can do wage record matches to actually evaluate whether or not someone has been placed in employment. But this work group is also going to be looking at the review structure. So what's the kind of committee process involved? What are the rubrics? How are we kind of scoring different elements of the proposal? So there's this kind of data transfer element, and there's also this kind of review architecture that we're going to need to develop to have a fair and transparent process. And then finally, the last group, also looking at data, but really thinking about the infrastructure that the state will need to, A, ensure compliance, but then B, I think, conduct meaningful evaluation of the programs so that we can message effectively to learners what they can expect when they finish a program. So what are the job opportunities? What are the potential wages? What are the advancement opportunities associated with getting this credential? And what are kind of the real costs that they can expect with the program? So what's Workforce Pell going to cover? What are the additional costs? What are the additional resources, ways that we can ecosystem? So again, we're focused on some of that kind of technical data infrastructure, but also thinking about how we're going to be messaging to learners, kind of following that journey, ensuring that additional support's provided to make sure there's no kind of gaps in the Workforce Pell process. So again, some kind of technical elements, but also this broader journey mapping that we'll be doing for kind of the learner focus, making sure they're centered in the experience. So that's an overview of the kind of deliverables for each of the work groups. I might have seen a hand at one point, so I'm happy to answer any questions about kind of the work group structure and the deliverables before I turn it back to Kelly.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Molly. And this may go back to Kelly, and there's probably water under the bridge, but it seems to me that reviewing the criteria every 2 years could lead to a pretty difficult to administer plan. I mean, that we then are always revisiting the decisions that we've made, and we might not get the continuity that we want to get. So again, maybe it's already done, but that seems really short term to me when we're trying to drive long-term growth.
Yeah, Molly, I think that's a great perspective to bring to the table. Ben, I don't know if it's a requirement that it's looked at every 2 years. It is it?
Oh yeah, sorry, I can clarify there if I didn't say it as well. So we have to update the list of priority occupations every 2 years, but not the definitions. So we'll be looking at new labor market information every 2 years to see have some occupations maybe change their median wages or some more in demand than they were previously. So the list of occupations itself will change, but I don't expect that the full definitions and this full application process will change every 2 years. But I think it'll help us ensure that we're keeping pace with changing economic labor market conditions without having to go through this whole work group process again and again.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Alice?
Good morning. Just a quick question, and I should know this by now, but are no other providers eligible except for institutions of higher ed, or do they have a different process? I'm just thinking about CTEX, of course, but also, I know a number of hospitals have started to develop programming again, or particular industries, apprenticeship types of things. I just was curious if there are any other eligible providers, or this is a at this time kind of thing.
Yeah, good question. And so this is one of the areas where in the final rulemaking, they're still tweaking the guidance. But right now, it is kind of limited to institutions of higher education, but they're allowed to partner with other training providers and spend, right now, it's I think 25% of the training funds with an external provider. And the debate right now is whether they should increase that percentage, again, to account for things like related technical instruction for apprenticeships. But it's really, I think, incumbent on the institutions of higher education to make those partnerships and to show that they have kind of all the formal written agreements in place. So that 25% could increase. I think that was, again, part of the public comment process ongoing, but they are trying to allow some flexibility there.
Thank you, Molly, for joining us this morning. Happy to follow up with you individually.
Thank you.
That was a great
Great.
question, Alice. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, right? That we can partner and expand some of these eligibilities. Any other questions? There's a lot of technical stuff that we threw out at all of you, and I know every time I hear it, it sinks in a little bit more. We gave a little bit of an overview at the last GWC meeting. This is maybe the second time you're hearing it. You can mull over these slides. But I think, we want you all to be very well informed of the work that is happening. And then also ask what level of participation in what particular areas you may want to participate. And we're not asking you to make a commitment today. We wanted to give you this whole overview. So we do have a timeline. We would like to get the first programs rolled out in January of 27. So we're taking that extra 6 months to really do this deep dive and put all of this work together. And so that means that we would need to get our recommendations to the governor's office by September. That way they can review everything and then put those applications to the feds for their approval process. And then with the goal of getting all of that done in the fourth quarter of this year to be able to launch in July. Now, I also want to set the expectation that this is not going to open up hundreds of credentials. Currently, we have put together a framework for those three criteria of high demand, high wage, high skill. And CT State has kind of run through what their existing programs are and how they would meet that criteria and the other criteria. And they've come up with approximately a list of 14 certifications currently, several in healthcare. Rose, I see you here and of great interest, others in manufacturing, and others in IT at this point in time. So this isn't going to open the floodgates, to start, but we also want to be really mindful that we start small and targeted to make sure that the process that we put together works and is manageable before we start adding. And then we foresee over time that our academic partners and our training partners, understanding what is eligible for Workforce Pell, will then be able to build new programs that meet those eligibility standards. So one of the standards that we did not put in here, but the program needs to be between 8 weeks and 15 weeks and between and under 599 hours. So there's that criteria as well that needs to be brought into this. So with all of that said, we kind of worked backwards in this timeline from the September GWC meeting and put some kind of dates in place. We know that summer is a super busy time for people. Not a lot happens in July usually in the state, but we feel that this is doable, and we have a really robust group of working groups from our state agencies and academic partners. So, for example, Employment and Credentialing has about 20 members. Credit Articulation has about 12, etc. So there are work groups already established. And so our interest here with all of you today is at what level would you like to participate or have members of your organizations participate as your designee to inform these policies, whether it's, you know, actively participating in working groups, lurking in working groups, knowing when they're going to be available and jumping on when you feel like you have the time and want to understand what's going on. But we'll also provide these stakeholder check-ins and with meetings more like this, where we'll be able to say, we have some things that we could share with you on these particular policies. And in a meeting such as this on a Friday morning or a Wednesday morning, we can get together and get your particular feedback and insights to those particular questions. So I'll pause there again for any questions or comments on the process.
Kelly, we will definitely be involved. It'll probably be one of our team members who leads our workforce development effort, but we will, once I get these slides, I can share them with them and we'll put together a plan to make sure that we have the right people on this.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rose. We really appreciate your continued partnership. So important. The other piece to this is that's related to the customer facing component is through the Career Connect funding, the $70 million ARPA fund, we built a statewide portal. And through targeted outreach, community outreach, we've had 42,000 people in the last 3 years come into the portal and register. And we'll be taking that portal back over into state service on July 1, and we'll be able to dramatically expand the what is included for credential earning within that portal. So I see an opportunity for that portal to have these credentials listed in them. And the other really neat thing about the portal is it helps people understand what the career pathways are that are available to them and what types of credentials they need along the way. And Rose and your group did an amazing job putting together these career pathways that really articulate what can you do in this pathway, occupational pathway with a high school diploma, a certification, an associate's degree, a bachelor's, and a graduate degree. And we would really love to be able to do that for the majority of the occupations that fit within these high demand areas that you all have. So that is something that is important to this. It's not exactly the rule making, but it is part of the outside advocacy of helping people understand how all of these credentials stack up to get them to where they would like to see their career trajectory go. Mirki, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so Kelly, here is Vadenka Mary Yukon president. Thank you for that presentation. And I would like, if you can think of the how this portal and things that we are trying to be accomplished can be shared with the higher education, that through our career planning, our graduates become aware of those opportunities, and how we build a library that can help the companies who need this workforce to say, go to that portal and you will see, do you have 1,000 software engineers or data scientists or welders, and can you relocate or expand your business in Connecticut?
Yes, thank you for that, Radenka. Greatly appreciate those comments. Um, there is a plan to have employer components added into the portal to do just that. Also, the portal can scrape job openings and push those job openings to people that are in the portal that meet those requirements. And that capability was launched just last fall, and we've employed almost 1,000 people in jobs because they get those notifications, and because the portal helps people identify what their current skill set is, and they map skills to occupations and help understand, what is of interest to them and where their skill gap is. There's all kinds of really amazing things that we can do within the portal, and we would love to have your participation and our employers' participation in designing what those additional capabilities are. We also have a lot of interest from the maritime industrial base because of the ability for us to put those credentials in there and have learning wallets, learning records, where people can bring that learning record and it can live within the portal. So, to your point, being employers being able to see who's got what and how they can match. And of course, we will be very conscious and mindful of all the security and the privacy that is associated with that. But the portal, as we built it as a prototype, has now become a national best practice, and many other states, including Massachusetts, is working to enhance and to build out a portal in their state. So we're very excited about that. Okay. Any other comments or questions? All right, next steps. So if you could please notify us by next Friday, if possible, of who you would like to participate from your entities and at what level. We will be following expediently back up with you. Ben and Mariki will be really doing a lot of this legwork on putting these programs and these working groups together, and we'll be continuously providing you updates on that work. Um, and so thank you very much for spending your Friday morning with us.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you all. Enjoy the weekend.
Thanks, Kelly. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.